Hello and welcome to F4S Digital today, where we're looking at the final stage of the recruitment process, and all that stands in your way of the job offer is that last interview. And again, we're focusing on your first role rather than a series of role interviews that you have throughout your life. And this is F4S events help students learn about a range of attributes that you need in order to navigate your way through the variety of jobs and roles that you have in the future. I'm Sherry Coutu and I'm your host today, and I'm really pleased to have with us Nick Kuenssberg, especially as we read today that in the FT that younger people have been the most hit by this coronavirus. Well, we're going to turn that around and make sure that you feel confident and know what you need to do in your interviews. A bit of housekeeping. You will see in here that the ability to chat has been turned off. And we do that for safeguarding reasons, because some of the people in the audience, in fact, most of the people in the audience are below the age of 18. So I want to start with Nick. Nick, thank you very much for joining us. We're speaking to you. You're in Scotland and I'm in Cambridge. And you've done a number of great interviews with us about employability, particularly for young students. You were the Chairman of Social Investment Scotland 2013 to 18, and you're currently the Chair of the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland. And the career that you've had has been phenomenal. You also act as chair to a number of startup companies and tech companies, which is great. And you're an active business angel and a mentor. Previously, you worked at Kuenssberg all over the world, and on the main board and throughout, and you have also previously been on the board of a couple of Quangos and chaired the Glasgow School of Art. Today we're going to talk about interviews. We're going to turn our focus just on the interview process, so that folks feel confident about what to do before, during, and afterwards. And we're structuring it as a conversation between Nick and I to sort of try to tease out the various lessons for everyone. So I'm going to start with sort of just trying to tease out bits of your experience, Nick. And we've got a series of sort of 8 questions that we've discussed in advance, and then we'll open up for the questions from the audience. So I wanted to start with, what are the common interview types that you know about and that you have used, and really for entry level positions? What are the ones that you have liked the most in all of those different hats that you've used?
It's undoubtedly person to person, and in fact, an improvement on the one-to-one is when you have a panel of maybe 2 or 3 people, because they're bringing their own individual experiences and their own agendas into play. And also for the interviewee, it gives them a much better understanding of the organization if they've got 2, 3, or even 4 people to do an inquisition on when they're given the opportunity at the end of the interview.
How do they, I mean, that sounds interesting. So I come into an interview and I've got 4 people arrayed in front of me. Why is that your favorite interview type? And what does that allow for you to get from the person who's being interviewed? Because it can be a little bit intimidating to walk into an interview and to see four people and to not really know how to approach it. What advice do you have for students who are having or thinking about their first panel interview?
Well, the first thing is to do the proper homework. Make sure that you understand why you're there, what it is that you're looking for. Is this the final one, as you suggested? In which case, you have got to make sure that you leave the panel with the idea that you are the candidate for them. If you've got 3 or 4 people to play off, first of all, make sure you get their names so that you can address them by name. And if you don't hear the name properly at first, ask again. No shame in that, because everybody understands that when introducing, it's often quite difficult to catch the name. Make sure you know where they're from, you know, which bit of the organization they're from, so that you understand what their agendas might be. And if you're very lucky, you will have been able to find out beforehand who those individuals are, and you will have done a bit of homework on them before as well.
That's one of my favorite, that is absolutely one of my favorite things. And I use LinkedIn extensively for that, so that I can, and I really do try to get the names in advance. And for me, my best friend is LinkedIn. I can go through everything that they've done before. I can maybe even see if they know anybody that I might know if I'm using it. But again, so there's lots of tricks in social media to be able to do good research on these folks and what they may be passionate about, which is helpful.
Yeah.
Do you have favorite types of questions? And when you use different types of questions in an interview, what's in your mind when you're trying to ask the question? And if we're, helping young people prepare for the types of questions they would be asked, giving them insights as to why you have favorite types of questions and what you're really asking when you're asking one type of question versus another type of question.
Yes, I think when you do a lot of interviewing, you do inevitably start to have a series of favorites. I think the key one, which sets the tone, is always why are you interested in this job? And if somebody comes up with a load of waffle, frankly, you've probably written them off before you go any further, although a good interviewer will hopefully give you a second chance. But it is absolutely key when you go in that you have an answer to that question, because even if it's not asked specifically, it will be asked by implication with some of the other questions. Another question, again, is to find out whether or not you've really thought about more than just that particular event. And it's to say, well, what is it that you would do well? What is it that you believe you can bring to the organization? And that, again, demonstrates whether or not you have thought about the job for which you're going.
And when you're, just if I interrupt for a second, if you're a candidate, when you've practiced these preparing for interviews in the past yourself, do you make sure that you anticipate these questions and answer them in your head, or do you practice them with colleagues or in front of the mirror? How do you make sure that when you answer that question in front of the real people, you sort of practice it a couple times in your head? What do you do?
I think you should have done that. Because it then gives you the confidence to look the interviewer in the eye, or look the interviewers in the eye, rather than to have your head down looking at your notes. It's perfectly legitimate to take notes in, by the way, but do not spend all your time reading from them. In my own case, because I worked for the same company for 27 years, I didn't actually have many sort of make or break interviews. As I explained in my first session, I had a number of very important meetings, appraisal meetings, but they weren't actually the make or break job interviews that I think we're talking about today. It is, however, important that you have thought these things through, so that even if you forget some of them, you've demonstrated that you've thought about them, and you have a narrative that you can offer the organization. You're not just answering with one-word answers as they sort of occur to you in desperation under the pressure of the interview.
Yeah, one-word answers are not good answers. I agree. It's you can sometimes sort of freeze. What are any other type of questions that you like asking, because it gives you insights into the motivations, those which show that they've done their homework, which I think is absolutely critical. Anything else?
One of them is a slightly unfair one, but it's an important one to determine the understanding and the honesty of the candidate. What gaps do you think there are in your CV or in your bag of competencies for this job, and how would you propose to cover those? And that is, what kind of training would you foresee, and what kind of training would you like to have if you got this job? And I think that's quite an important one, because if you're going for a job, the assumption is that you're going for something which is ahead of what you've been doing before. So you want to demonstrate your ambition, but you want to be realistic about your attributes as well.
Yeah, I think that's good. One of my favorite books is called The Alliance, and it's by Reid Hoffman, and I don't know if you've read it, but it talks about understanding that an interview or a conversation about, even if it's a new role in a company, about why is this aligned to what you want to do? Why do you want this job? What will it help you do to position, as you navigate your future? Yeah. And I like that way of looking about it. I think that people, despite what the media may have you think, do have a choice about who they work for, and they absolutely have a choice about the problems that they choose to solve. And the way that we solve problems is by choosing which companies whose mission we wish to, almost grace with our presence to a certain extent. So I think it's super important.
And that's why I like a panel interview, because the interviewee has the opportunity to understand much better an organization when they've got 2 or 3 or 4 people to play off.
Any other questions about sort of how others sort of perceive them, or how do you, any other questions?
Yeah, the 2 big ones, which I always ask, are what have you made a success of? And even if you're going for a first job, you have presumably done something at school, or you've been a member of the Scouts, or you've been good at sport, or you play an instrument and you've been part of an orchestra. And so you want to make clear that you have been successful in that, even if your experience is fairly short. And you want to be able to explain why you've been a success at it. And then there's the obverse of that, is when you say, and what about, have you had any failures in your life? And if somebody says, no, I've never had any failures at all, you begin to wonder whether they're being honest with themselves, whether they have any understanding of life in general, because even the most successful people have failures, and it would be nice if they were open and honest about that.
I think I don't like the word failure.
Sorry, Sherry. And if they have learned from it,
yes,
that's the most important thing. We've got to be learning, and in fact, last Wednesday I was talking about genuine lifelong learning from our experiences. As I said, I think every day is a school day. We all have mini failures, whether it's we haven't been able to convince somebody totally of something that we would like them to do. Why did we not succeed? Where did we fall down? What can we learn from that, so that going forward, we can be more successful?
I completely agree. I actually really dislike the word failure. And maybe it comes from my science background of testing hypotheses. If you've not failed, then you've not tested enough hypotheses, or maybe you're not trying hard. The way that we make the world better is by solving with other people really hard problems. And if we're not prepared to fail, then we might not solve some of those issues, some of those problems that we have, which are opportunities that are in front of us. So I don't like failure, because a failure is you've tested a hypothesis, you're going to get past it, you're going to try another way, and then you'll learn what it was you did differently the second time when you did succeed, or maybe it's the 25th time when you became an overnight success. I've got many companies where they tried for years and years and years and tried all sorts of different things, and it wasn't until the 25th or even 30th time that they finally got it. And I think that resilience and perseverance and thinking of it as testing hypotheses and learning is super important for all of us, particularly in these times, these crazy times where we are at the moment. One last favorite question before we go on to the next question that I have for you.
Well, I have 2, if I may. One is, how would your peers describe you? And again, at any stage of our life, we have peers of some sort. And I think that demonstrates an insight and whether we're able to take on board what other people say. I mean, I've been married for 55 years and my wife still despairs that I don't always get what it is she's saying. So that's a never-ending journey. But the other question,
I'm going to turn around. How would your peers describe you before we go on to your final question? And sort of.
Oh, that's really unfair question at this stage. They would probably say that I'm reasonably easy to work with until it comes to deadlines when I am very demanding. They would say that I was an impatient person. They would say that I was demanding in the standards that I expect from them. And they would say he probably relies too much on his experience and not on his technical skills, which would be absolutely correct. Because I look on myself as a jack of all trades rather than a master of anything at all.
Great. Well, again, it's for each his own. Some people are amazing at being a master of one, and others are generalists. And I think it's teams where you're pulling out these attributes and putting them together. So one final question that you like to ask in interviews, and then we'll move on.
Yes, this may not be quite as fashionable in today's world as it was when I was starting my career 60 years ago. But I would like to ask people, where do you see yourself in 5 years? Because I'd like to see people who are thinking of a life in the organization, what they can contribute to it, where they could help to take the organization, and the kind of responsibilities that they would like to see themselves able to cope with and take forward in a longer time scale.
I think that's really important. And for me, when I ask that interview question, I might shorten it to 2 years, but again, I like to see where their curiosity lies. It also helps when you're thinking about, let's say they've had one role for 3 or 4 months, about which of the next projects that might be right for them because they've let you know what they're interested in. So that probably is my favorite question of all the questions that you've gone through. So I've got, moving on to the next, which is there's sometimes competency-based interviews. And again, there's a reading in the resource center on F4S Digital for you afterwards if you're watching this as a webinar. But what are your tips for students who are facing competency type interviews?
Pretty straightforward. Make sure that you have at least one and preferably 2 examples of where you have demonstrated those competencies. And again, they don't have to be in a work scenario. They could be in the activities which you undertake elsewhere, whether they're lone activities, playing your violin, or whether they are team activities in your local football team. Just make sure that you've got something specific so that you get away from the potential of waffling, which is, for me, the absolute crime in any interview.
Yes. I think the thing that I look for the most is probably that they can be part of a team, because in work we're all drawing on, it's together a team-based effort. So particularly if it's an entry stage and they may not have had a permanent job before, I want to look at, if it's football, fine, but maybe it's baking contest, I don't know what it is, or marathons that they do in their spare time. Is there anything that indicates that they can work well in a team? Again, that's generally, will they fit in and will they muck in is a really important, to make sure is, a candidate can demonstrate that. And again, if it's their first job, and for many people watching today, they'll be thinking about their their first entry role position. They're like, well, I don't have a job. How can I get a job? It's like, well, there are many, many things you can do that develop your competencies, and you just need to think about that. So I think that's a great point. I've got some questions which are, going a little bit into the war story part. So, and what are the biggest gaffes that you've ever witnessed of a candidate, it's sort of in an entry level sort of interview that you've seen, so that anybody watching this now or in the future will go, oh, well, I'll make sure I never do that. What are the biggest ones that you've seen, and just lessons well, from the whole phase?
I talked about a couple when we had a selection board in the company I worked for many years, Coates. And we used to have a 2-day session in a hotel where we did a whole range of things. There were IQ tests, personality tests, impromptu speeches, team exercises, big problem solving exercises. But we also had a dinner and then gave them the evening at the bar. And we always had a couple of our personnel assistants who were around at the time as well. And there was one guy who was really very, very impressive, but he was so pleased with himself. He flirted with these two girls and didn't really behave himself very well. And that, I'm afraid, persuaded us that we were not going to take his suit any further. Apart from that, there were a couple of guys who managed to get themselves a little bit the worse for wear for drink. And interestingly, just one company used to make sure that people drank an awful lot. And then, to their surprise, they were taken off to do an exercise. And the justification for that was that in their industry, they sometimes had to make decisions when they were in a social atmosphere, at a social event, and possibly had drunk too much. That particularly applied to the advertising industry 30, 40 years ago. I don't know whether it's still valid. It's an interesting.
I don't know, but it's good advice. Again, to remember that when you're at a job interview, you're at a job interview, and when you're at work, you're always kind of at a job interview, and you should behave appropriately. This is kind of a question which is probably more oriented towards the tech industry, which many people, may want to be entering into. And it's have you ever offered a candidate a job right there in an interview? Is that common or uncommon in your experience?
I've only done it once in my life before, and that was because we were very aware that this particular individual, in fact, he told us that he had a job offer from somebody else, and he was patently absolutely outstanding, and we made sure that we got him. But between I think there were 3 of us in the panel, we realized that we were in the presence of somebody pretty outstanding who we ought to hang on to. In the Coates selection board scenario, we used to, they used to disappear the following morning. And if there were some outstanding candidates, again, one of us would be sort of hanging around as they disappeared, and would have a quiet word and say, if we were to offer you, would you accept? And that was because, again, there was very big competition for the outstanding candidates for overseas working. I think in the software world, again, there are individuals who come in and impress enormously, and they are hugely competed for, and you may have to make a quick decision. I prefer to respect the process that we have established. It demonstrates to the candidate that there is competition for that job and that we are an organized operation. But I would usually say that we would be getting back to you within the next 24 hours, because in most situations, you have your group sitting around and you will make sure that you're actually making a decision while you're all there, so that subject to any reference or any clarification of somebody's qualifications, if you've got some doubt about them, or if you want to get a reference, which incidentally I always do by telephone. I'm not interested in written references at all, and I prefer to talk to the previous boss, and that way you can get a good feeling of how they were viewed in the organization and whether there was any dirty linen around.
Okay, so I'm going to just keep on going because again, I'm mindful of time. So just a question, there are different ways of doing interviews, particularly now, telephone, in person, Skype, over Zoom. What's your, what's your favorite and why do you prefer, do you have a preference and what is it?
Oh, the preference is definitely face-to-face, in real life. If for all the reasons that we now are very much aware of, it's necessary to do it remotely, then I would rather do it by Skype or by Zoom. I'd rather have the potential to see the individual. Again, you can tell so much from somebody's body language, and frankly, just the way they present themselves and the way they dress. I mean, you really don't want to be interviewing somebody on Zoom and they're sitting there in a scruffy t-shirt or in their pajamas and they haven't shaved that morning, or they're not showing any respect for the organization or for you as the interviewer.
Yeah. Okay.
You can probably get away with that on the telephone, but I would suggest that if you have a telephone interview, you still probably want to brush up and feel that you're being businesslike, and that will probably come across in the way you present yourself.
Yeah, no, I'm sure that's the case. Just a question, what is the best follow-up you've ever had from a candidate after an interview?
This is something which actually didn't used to happen and has not been a great factor in my particular life. The one that you welcome is where somebody writes in, preferably if they've done a good interview, and they say they're really, really keen on the job. They had possibly not emphasized X or Y as much as they would have liked, but they believe that marks them out as somebody special. But under any circumstances, they were really pleased to have been invited. They're very grateful to have had the opportunity, and they will take away good memories of their interaction with that company.
Yeah, I think that's good. And then just on the corollary of that, what's the worst follow-up that you've ever had that made you think, I'm definitely not hiring this person?
The worst one was where somebody did a terrible interview and wrote in and said, I possibly didn't do quite as well as I would have liked, but here is a testimonial from a previous boss or somebody which shows that I really am an outstanding person. And, you just go, ugh.
Okay, great. So as, again, our audience, F4S, is for younger sort of teenagers, and they'll be thinking about their first job. And maybe, it could be 5, 6, 7. Just can you talk to me about work experience and internships as a route to permanent roles? Because I think we often have 5, 6, 7 different internships, and sometimes you can, pull pints in a pub. Other times you can get really interesting roles or projects in startups in the tech world. And I know that you're an angel investor. Do your tech investments use interns and projects with students? And is that positive both for them and for the students? And do you see it as a good stepping stone onto being able to differentiate yourself when you do decide to go for a permanent role?
Absolutely. In both the companies which I currently am invested in and chair, they are both software development companies, and we use students. I'm afraid that we don't use school leavers, but we do use students, and we insist on paying them the minimum wage as well. We don't believe in free internships. We give people the respect because often these students are really very good. And in both companies, we have actually recruited from those people who have done internships, which could be for only 2 or 3 weeks. Most of them are for 6 or 7 months, and they'll do between 8 and 12 hours a week with us. So they're actually earning really quite decent money. They're learning about the company. They're learning what it's like to be part of a commercial organization, and they have the opportunity to impress us with what they're up to. In one of the companies, we actually had up to a dozen students because we had a huge data mining exercise, which we had to complete within, I think it was a 9-week period. And these students were absolutely fabulous. And 2 of them went on, completed their degrees and came back, and they're both working with us now.
Yeah,
So
I think I think that's great. There's a couple of questions coming in on one thing to remember about internships is that in I think 30% of the cases they do end up in a job offer after you've had a very long courtship to decide if that's the right organization for you. And I think that these projects, particularly now where companies don't have permanent positions, but they've got lumpy projects here and there, it's wonderful experience. Also on some of the soft skills that we have. So the communication, teamwork, puzzles, working on hard things. I think it's great. So if you're not considering internships, do think about it, because I think it's the best onboarding for anybody, particularly pre an entry position.
I couldn't agree more.
Brilliant. We've got so Founders for Schools has a sister company called Workfinder, and if you're looking for internships, again, I'm sure they'd love to hear from you. They're sort of an app or a web thing. There's a question that we've got here, Nick, just before, and again, we're running out of time. And the question is, I have a tattoo on my neck. Should I cover it up at interviews?
It depends entirely on which kind of company you're going to. I suspect if you're going to a software high-tech company, it wouldn't matter a damn. If you're going to a more traditional company, if you're going to try and join a firm of lawyers or accountants, I would think twice about it, and I would have a high-neck blouse or shirt on.
Yes, I think that's exactly right. If you're going in a traditional company, they may not welcome it. Software companies, people really just, I think, want to know what you're going to do and how you're going to help them progress their project or their company. And to me, tattoos don't matter, but I've been in the software world for such a long time. But I think that's good advice. We probably need to wind up with that, Nick, because we're out of time, and I feel like I could talk to you forever. And you've got such a huge amount of experience that I don't really want to let you go, but you've got something else to say. Okay, one last thing.
One final point.
Yeah.
Be yourself in the interview. Don't try and be somebody else. Be yourself. Do all your homework so that you are as relaxed as possible. You take away as much stress as possible. But please be yourself. That is what you're selling. And the last thing you want to do is to try and pretend that you're something that you're not.
That is very good advice to end on, and something I completely agree with. If you're at work, you're there for quite a lot of hours, and you have to be yourself, and you have to be working on something that you're excited about. So the other thing I would say is make sure that you actually want to work for the company that you're interviewing with. because there's nothing that you want to get out of faster than if you find yourself at a company that you maybe didn't think hard enough about. Right, Nick, this is your third time that you've spoken with us, and we're just so grateful for everything that you're doing for us and for the next generation. I hope that we will speak again, and I look forward to seeing what we talk about at that time. But for now, I'm going to have to call it to a close. Thank you very much for spending time with us and for preparing as you did for your interview about interviews. I think so. If you haven't caught the other two interviews or sort of sessions with Nick, then please go on to the F4S Digital website. And if you're interested in, again, sort of resources about interview techniques, etc., you can also go onto our website and download. They're there for you to use. And we want to get you onto the track of your first and second and third and fourth interview, and until where you're actually also interviewing others. So thank you very much for watching. Nick, thank you very much for joining us. Really appreciate your time.